Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar, The Overflowing Risks of Biodiversity Loss, a closer look at freshwater. My name is Robin Miller, and I use she and her pronouns. I'm a manager at Ceres on our water team, and I'm delighted to be co-moderating this session with my colleague, Christine Gurdon from our Food and Forest team, who you'll meet in a minute or so. The state of our natural world has captured global investor attention thanks to research emphasizing the monetary value of ecosystem services and the alarming rates of species loss, especially within freshwater ecosystems. Biodiversity, which is an indicator of ecosystem health, has declined at unparalleled rates for decades because of human activity, with no signs of slowing down. Our rivers, lakes, and streams teem with life when water quality and quantity are maintained, but this biodiversity can quickly degrade when too much, too little, or too dirty water flows through the ecosystem. Society as a whole relies on quantity and quality of fresh water, so a loss in biodiversity in both terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems impacts business operations and livelihoods. In other words, without water, we can't even begin to secure species protection and preserve biodiversity. So for our agenda today, we are going to explore how biodiversity loss and water-related risks are interconnected. We will then hear from the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation to discuss how biodiversity hotspots are important and why maintaining those areas are particularly important, especially when they're connected to water stress and freshwater ecosystem protection. We'll have a great fireside chat with one of our investors, and then we'll wrap up with a Q&A and sharing out some resources and opportunities for you to stay engaged on these topics. So we'll give a brief introduction to the stellar set of speakers that we have for today. Myself, I am a manager at Ceres on our water team. I'm joined by Christine Gurdon, a manager of investor engagement on our Food and Forest team. Coming to us from the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation is Joel Johnson, who is the Chief Marketing and Communications Officer. And then from Sumitomo Mitsui Trust Asset Management, we have Masaru Okubo, who is an investment director. I next want to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of the lands and waterways that we are all on today, which we each call home. We are amidst a global biodiversity and water crisis. We are feeling, seeing, and hearing the effects of these crises in a variety of ways from wherever we are joining today, whether that be species loss, drought, flooding, pollution, and more. Since we are all joining virtually, I invite you to take a moment to think about the past stewards of the land and the waterways that you value most. Imagine what your life would be like without those past stewards. And imagine what life will be like for future generations if we don't work together now to drive action to protect our land, water, and biodiversity. So thank you for taking that moment with me. Ceres was founded by a group of investors in 1989 in response to the Exxon Valdez oil spill. And Ceres, for those of you who aren't familiar, leverages the power of the capital markets to solve some of the world's greatest sustainability challenges. Over the past 30 years, we've approached this challenge through a unique theory of change, and that is to make the financial business case for sustainability to the largest, most influential investors, companies, policymakers, and regulators. One resource I would like to lift up relevant to the topic today is the Ceres Roadmap for 2030. There is a whole section dedicated to protecting water and natural resources. So I encourage you after this webinar to review the recommendations for action and case studies of leading practice, which illustrates the connection and interconnections between nature and water. Now, before we dive into the content, we are going to create a word cloud together, and we're using a platform called Menti. So you can see on the slide today the question, which is, why is biodiversity important to preserve? In the chat, you'll see a direct link that you can go to. You can also, on another device or in another window, go to menti.com and put the code that you see on the top of the screen. So just enter in 1 or 2 words, and we will start to see the word cloud populate with why is biodiversity important to preserve? So I invite all folks who are joining in to contribute to the word cloud. And I will also say we'll continue to use this platform for a few additional questions. So I know it might take a minute. We're seeing a few things come in here. So lots of great reasons here: food sustainability, diversity is resilience. It's important for addressing climate change, for well-being, for the future. There's a lot of good themes here. We'll give it a few more seconds so folks can submit their responses. Ecosystem functionality, for peace. Seeing resilience mentioned a few times in here, balance. Yeah, this is great. So thank you all for contributing to this word cloud. We're now going to move on to some brief overviews about our programmatic areas before we jump into the content. So on the water side, which I contribute to, for more than a decade, Ceres has worked with influential institutional investors, large companies, and fellow nonprofit organizations to address the global water crisis. Over the past 6 years, we've expanded to focus working with institutional investors as we continue to see water risk play out in real time and impact the financial performance of a range of industries and geographies. The Ceres Valuing Water Finance initiative, which is one of our newer initiatives, brings an innovative approach designed to move capital markets to view water as a financial risk and act on it accordingly. As a part of the larger water community's efforts to advance better water management, we at Ceres are focusing on institutional investors and ultimately corporations to drive wholesale change. I'll touch on how you can get involved with this work towards the end of the webinar. So with that, I will transition this over to my colleague, Christine, who will share a little bit more about our Food and Forest program and move into talking about the interconnections between biodiversity and freshwater. So Christine, I will pass the virtual mic over to you.
Great, thank you, Robin. So yeah, Ceres also has a food and forest program where we seek to drive large-scale changes in the way our food and agricultural commodities are produced and sourced. So knowing that deforestation, land conversion, and agricultural practices contribute approximately 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions, in order to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, we strive to protect, improve, and restore our natural landscapes. So in order to work towards that goal, we are building investor awareness and capacity on social and environmental issues around deforestation and land conversion, fostering investor collaboration and engagement with companies, and supporting the integration of social and environmental issues into investment policies. Now, we do this work through our Land Use and Climate Working Group, which focuses on 4 major topic areas. And these are commodity-driven deforestation and land conversion, biodiversity, natural climate solutions, and greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. So before I introduce our first guest speaker, I want to give a brief overview on the interconnectedness between biodiversity loss and water-related risks. So water risk. This is the possibility of an entity experiencing a water-related challenge. Now, this risk can be thought of in 2 perspectives. From an availability perspective, meaning either too much or too little water, or from a quality perspective, which relates to the chemical characteristics of the water. From there, water risk generally falls into either a physical risk, a regulatory risk, or a reputational risk. And here we have a couple of examples of each of these types of risk. And I just want to focus your attention on the physical box. So from an availability perspective, this refers to droughts and floods, where from a quality perspective, this relates to water chemistry variability or temperature changes. Next slide, please. Thanks. So there are a number of factors that heighten water-related risks, and some of these include a growing population and outdated infrastructure, pollution and climate change. And now what we're seeing is that biodiversity loss heightens these water-related risks. Now, biodiversity loss heightens water-related risks because biodiversity supports ecosystem services. And by ecosystem services, we mean the benefits that we as a society receive from the ecosystem. So when biodiversity is reduced, the ecosystem services are reduced in either quantity or quality, and this heightens the water-related risks. And here we have listed a couple of ecosystem services related to water, such as water regulation, waste treatment, and recreation and ecotourism. So when those services are reduced, your water-related risks are heightened. So to kind of put these concepts or to apply these concepts, let's take a freshwater ecosystem as an example. So a freshwater ecosystem is composed of a number of different habitats and communities, and they are all interconnected. So whatever type of impact happens to one community, it's going to impact another community and overall affect the entire ecosystem and the services that the ecosystem provides. So as a very high level example, let's just look at some aquatic vegetation on the banks of a freshwater ecosystem. Say for some reason, the diversity is reduced within the vegetation. This will impact the diversity of microorganisms in the soil. Now, both of these communities are really important when it comes to detoxifying and purifying pollutants that come into the aquatic ecosystem. So when these communities are reduced in biodiversity, the detoxification and purification capabilities of the whole ecosystem will diminish, which will then heighten the water-related risks, specifically around the quality perspective. Now, these water-related ecosystem services aren't just found in freshwater ecosystems. They're also apparent in terrestrial ecosystems, such as a forest. So kind of applying that same concept to a forest, when a forest loses biodiversity, the soil diversity will also decrease. And this will impact the soil ecosystem processes, one of them being local water retention. So in this scenario, when you decrease the forest biodiversity, the local water retention will suffer, which will heighten the water-related risks coming from that availability perspective. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our first guest speaker, Joel Johnson, Chief Marketing and Communications Officer at the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation, who will talk about some biodiversity hotspots around the world, as well as dive a little deeper into some of the ecosystem services that businesses and livelihoods depend on.
Well, hello, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here. My name is Joel Johnson, and I am the Chief Marketing and Communications Officer at the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation. And I've been with the foundation for almost a year now. I have a background in marketing, advertising, public relations, and conservation. I was formerly the Chief Marketing Officer of Trout Unlimited, North America's largest cold water conservation organization, and I spent about 20 years of my career in promoting purpose-based brands, as well as nonprofits that are focused on conservation, preserving the nature and the ecology. So I'm delighted to speak with you today about the work of the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation and our namesake, E.O. Wilson's life work for the last 92 years, as he has set about to help us preserve and protect life on Earth and the diversity of life on Earth, which we refer to as biodiversity. And I, as Christine has offered, wanted to share with you both some personal stories that will help to put this task into context, as well as some of the details around the importance of the tools that are currently being used to measure and monitor biodiversity around the world in these hotspots, and as well as some of the things that organizations, NGOs, nonprofits, governmental organizations, the corporate sector, and particularly investors can do to help us work on protecting biodiversity globally. So I'm also going to share a brief presentation with you and perhaps give you a glimpse of some of those tools. So I will be sharing my screen at times. And of course, feel free to pop a question into the Q&A, and we'll try to get to it in the later part of the discussion. All right. I am going to go ahead now and get started. So let me jump right in and sort of share with you a couple of details around my background and how I arrived at this particular organization, and the importance also of biodiversity and the way in which the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation particularly works on this area. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. Okay. All right. So let's jump right in. So first of all, I think it's obviously a personal mission. Many of us have a connection with freshwater. For me, it's fishing. I've spent most of my life connecting with rivers, lakes, seas, and the ocean around me. And whenever I can, I try to get out there and experience the outdoors through my passion. For many, it's swimming, it's boating, it's simply recuperating and resting alongside a natural body of water. And in many ways, we take it for granted, the presence of fresh water around us. But it obviously provides so much to us as a species and also to the world's species. For me, there is obviously a recuperative and healthy ecosystem service, if you will, that I connect with. But let's be honest, I mean, our freshwater is really under threat, and it's perhaps in the top 3 most endangered areas across the globe. We think about these crises that we face of climate change, biodiversity loss, and freshwater. Well, they're all interconnected, and they're interconnected at the species level. For example, when you take, to just dive into an example, when you take the Central and South Florida, and we think about the amount of fresh water, the millions and millions of gallons that flow through that state, through Lake Okeechobee, and then down into the Everglades. And you think about the human impact of sort of bottling up that fresh water in the lake and then allowing the nutrient load to build in that lake because of farming, rain-fed agriculture, and other pressures, and then releasing that back out into the ecosystem, it could have devastating effects. And in fact, what it does is it creates that blue-green algae and also the red tide that basically, ultimately harms both those rivers, the people who live alongside of it, and all the species that are there. And this is really just a small symptom of a larger problem. In 2019, the United Nations released a really apocalyptic report that said, we are at risk of losing 1 million of the estimated 10 million species on this planet by 2050 if we don't act now, if we don't reverse course and get wiser and smarter about how we use and participate in the ecosystem of this planet. That was one of the founding principles really for the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation, and spurred us to create the Half Earth Project. E.O. Wilson himself is perhaps the world's most esteemed naturalist and biologist. He's known as the Father of Biodiversity, and he's commented on this in particular in his book, Half Earth, The Fight for the Planet's Future. And he basically laid it out for us as it's very straightforward. And unless we learn a great deal more about global biodiversity and we move very quickly to protect it, we're going to lose it. We're going to lose it. And unlike a natural landscape that can potentially be restored or rewilded, when you lose a species, which is the benefit of millions of years of evolution, it's gone and it's gone forever. Fortunately, E.O. Wilson's research in his early career led him to develop a theory that can help support how we can address restoring global biodiversity and protecting it. And that was the theory of island biogeography. Really straightforward and very simple. He went to an island, and then in that island, he observed how life proliferated after that island grew in size. So as the size of an island grows, the diversity of life surviving on that island also grows in a mathematical and predictable way. This theory of island biogeography led to the principle of half Earth. And this is the key idea of half Earth. If you set aside roughly 45% to 50% of the Earth's land and seas, you can protect millions and millions and millions of species that interconnected make up global biodiversity. So that's a tall order. How it's even perhaps a little, sounds a little crazy. How do you protect all that land? Well, first of all, it starts with connecting with people and helping them to understand very precisely why it's important to protect our biodiversity hotspots, why it's important to protect half of the Earth and half of our seas. Well, as Christine shared, ecosystem services really are about all the positive benefits that are out there that come from wildlife and ecosystems that benefit us. And when we, in turn, take care of wildlife and the natural world around us, it also benefits wildlife and species. So some of the areas in which we do that are provisioning, regulating their cultural ecosystem services, and then supporting ecosystem services. And all of them basically point to one thing. They point to preserving life on Earth. So whether it's food, or fresh water, or even our medicines that we derive from our natural environment, whether it is, for me, my passion of fishing or subsistence fishing for another community, those are important factors that we can consider as we think about how we're going to go about investing in companies, technologies, systems, even governments, and how they approach protecting the environment. It's thinking in a way about what are the nature-based solutions, what are the broad benefits that can come about that sometimes aren't exactly clear on a balance sheet, but when you step back and you look at the communities that you serve or that you're a part of, can have an added effect. One of the places I love to go fishing in is in Alaska, in a place called Bristol Bay. It is an absolutely amazing biodiversity hotspot. There's 29 fish species there, 190 birds, 40 mammals, and every year the salmon run happens, where the salmon go out to the ocean and then they come back in to this bay, something in the order of 40 million sockeye salmon alone. And then there are 7 species of salmon, all returning in the millions. Well, what does that mean? What does that feel like? What does that do? Well, when we think about this in the context of ecosystem services, we can think about it as, well, that's 20,000 jobs in Alaska. That is 80% of the food that the indigenous people, the Yupik and the Dina, consume in the Bristol Bay area. That is the livelihoods of 4,000 locals. It is a $1.5 billion fishery. Now, those are all numbers, of course, and I think you have to go there and see it with your own eyes to see the life pulsing in and out of the rivers to really find a deeper connection to it. But we can rationalize as well as think about some of the more spiritual or even emotional connections to ecosystems and why they provide so many positive benefits to us. At Half Earth, we have a nature-based solution approach. And ultimately, 3 major tasks in front of us that we use to do our job. One is to identify and map all the life on Earth, both the discovered and the undiscovered life, because there are still undiscovered species being found in biodiversity hotspots around the world every single day. We invest in deep science in order to do that. And we take advantage of modern technology, including satellite technology, remote sensing, algorithmic research, and we pull that together to develop a map, a way of envisioning where life is, the richness and the rarity of it. We also try to understand the human impact on species. So what does that mean? That could be agriculture, urban pressures. How we tap into fresh water, for example, is incredibly complex when we take into consideration, groundwater and municipal systems and water we take out for manufacturing and our food system. And then it's really important to incorporate traditional wisdom. This is something that is really being understood right now and considered and brought into conservation biology. And it's something you'll see more and more of as this year in particular, in this particular moment of biodiversity, we see the nations around the world gather in these three major meetings. We saw it at the IUCN World Congress last month. In just a month's time, we have the COP 15, Convention on Biological Diversity meeting, and then a month after that in Glasgow, COP 26, where they'll be talking about climate change. And all of these things are interwoven, where there's a call to bring in the traditional wisdom of indigenous peoples around the world to help inform this mission. And why is that? Well, it's because something on the order of 75% of the world's biodiversity, global biodiversity, can be found on indigenous lands. It's fascinating. Well, all this for us, it means, if we back that into our research, we back that into our theory of half Earth, setting aside half the land and sea in order to protect life, it has to basically come down to a local reality. And that reality could be for you all on the investor level as you make decisions. For governments, right now, it's happening at a level of a program called 30 by 30, which is where the global nations are coming together to have an interim goal on the way to half Earth to protect 30% of the Earth and seas by 2030. And then you might be familiar with the rewilding movement, that is taking large patches of land and sea that have been used previously for manufacturing, farming, agriculture, and other uses, and rewilding it in order to restore biodiversity. When we dive into freshwater, a few things to be mindful of. Again, as I said earlier, it's incredibly complex, and our footprint as well is really wide. It's not just the lakes and the rivers and the groundwater, but it's also our wetlands that surround where humans inhabit. It also is our ephemeral streams. And these are places that are dry as a bone during half the year, but when you get rain and snow melt, suddenly become waterways. It's how we recharge that groundwater. It's how we use fresh water for flood regulation and erosion control. And in fact, water itself controls microclimates. Very complex, very powerful system. And freshwater in particular is also critical for, of course, our drinking water. And as we think about how do we express the work we're going to do, how do we make decisions, what are the metrics that we need to be considering? It's a complicated system. What matters most, I would say, is that the guidance and the research that you pursue, you try to pursue it at a broad level, right? So it's not just understanding the science, which is important, but it's also understanding what's happening on the ground in local communities and the decision makers, the choices that local decision makers and governments have to make between all of these ecosystem services and the fresh water, and then the systems and the choices they have to make for their community. It's a balance, and it's a balancing act. What we do at the Half Earth Project is we try to provide information that helps inform those decisions. And we do that through the Half Earth Project map, which I'm going to give you a little bit of a glimpse of. The Half Earth Project map lives on halfearthproject.org, and you can kind of go in. It's built on the ArcGIS system, and you can explore, as I'll show you, what the map can reveal about richness, rarity, and biodiversity. So let me just dive in here on my screen and give you a quick 1 second, or what we used to call a 10-penny tour. So the map itself basically shows species biodiversity and richness and rarity. And those are the three most common metrics we use in conservation biology to identify species and to talk about our impact on them. And what the Half-Earth Project maps shows is something that is particular to our way of doing this research, which is the impact on global biodiversity. Because we know the Earth is one big connected ecosystem. And when you remove a part of that ecosystem, like Jenga, the tower can fall. So what we try to do is help people to make decisions based on how do I not just preserve my patch in my corner, but how do I preserve global biodiversity? So here you can see I'm rotating the map. The map itself does map biodiversity, priority, richness, and rarity, but it also shows something that you might be interested in, which is the human pressures, urban pressure, rain-fed agriculture, and irrigated agriculture. So let's dive in a little bit on some place that I know is going to be very rich in biodiversity, and that's our Gulf Coast near Florida. As you can see, this map says that global terrestrial vertebrates are in high priority of being protected. And you can see here in yellow on the map, these are the areas that we believe need to be protected. It's where we also overlap the world's biodiversity. So you can get a sense that biodiversity really plays a big role along our coasts, right? And near our major waterways. And then as I dive in here with this map and get a little closer and closer and closer, we can go down to a very, very high level of resolution. Now, the Half-Earth Project map is one tool of many. When you're doing your research, I suggest that you look broadly and make sure you have a number of different sources. But if you're thinking about what is the impact, for example, of say, our urban pressures on biodiversity and where does this overlap with areas that need to be protected, this map can be potentially helpful for you. If we, for example, wanted to have an understanding of the rain-fed agriculture and its impact in a particular area, you can also look at the map and see that. And here's a great example. You can see in the center here of southern Florida, Lake Okeechobee. Okeechobee, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the areas where we are seeing a lot of fresh water being impounded, but then as its nutrient load increases because of agriculture and it's released into the Caloosahatchee River and the St. Lucie River, it has these devastating effects on the area around it. But with this, you can actually quite literally see what that kind of pressure looks like. So typically global biodiversity, and I'm going to back out of this now and go back to the presentation and just show you one more slide here that I think will be important. As we think about freshwater, it's important to understand that freshwater is the lifeblood of our continents, right, and our countries. And the freshwater is really home to not just invertebrate, but vertebrate species. And it's really the source of a lot of the richness of the biodiversity in the world. But if it's not protected, if it's not being monitored, and if there aren't scientists and they're constantly researching the species and the wildlife there, then we kind of run into a problem where our needs as a society can overshadow the needs of the rest of the species and the wildlife that are present. This is a good example, southern Florida. On the left here on this slide, you'll see freshwater species is actually almost in all of these blue lines. And all of, and we think about southern Florida, and we think about it as kind of maybe a swamp, right? The Everglades. We don't think about it as arteries channeling water through an ecosystem. And so, the richness here is just really, really high. But over on the right, you can see here, the number of protected areas is very scant. It's not enough. And so, the balance that we have to take into consideration as we basically move to, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, as we move to, well, frankly, to extend our, and build on our society, right? So whether it's technology, businesses, farming and agriculture, manufacturing, or other social services, they all have a water load on their local freshwater. And I think we have a responsibility, as investors, in particular, to understand the impact of those choices on the local biodiversity. And in this particular case, we've taken this deep dive into freshwater because it's such a lodestone, it's such a place where we can focus on biodiversity. But it's important to understand that, as I said, that local waterway is connected to a national waterway, a global biodiversity that we need to protect. And as you make choices, as you look for information to guide your decisions, what we often offer at the Half Earth Project is to think about not just from a sort of a human-centric or anthropocentric point of view about what we need in order to be successful, but also what the wildlife and the species needs as well to create a successful ecosystem, because after all, we are a part of that ecosystem. And that's how we can protect global biodiversity. So I'll close on that note, and thank you again for having me to share a little bit of insight into the work that we do, and hopefully it can inform some of the work that you have to do.
Thank you so much, Joel. It was great to hear your personal perspective, what brings you to this work, and that great call to action, and as well for sharing all of the resources and the scientific backing that goes into the work. So thank you so much, and we'll bring you back on for a Q&A later. We're already getting some great questions in, so keep those coming in. So as we transition to our next segment, we have another question for you. This is an open answer. You don't just have to keep it to one word, but what role should businesses play in preserving freshwater biodiversity? So Joel really set the context for why the work that the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation are doing, and Christine shared about these interconnections between biodiversity and freshwater. So we'd love to hear from the audience. What role do you think businesses should play as we transition to our segment next with investors? So we'll give folks a moment to get back on Menti, and I'll put a plug that we'll have one more question for you as we close out the session, so you can feel free to keep that Menti open. So we'll give it another few seconds to see what questions we get in, or what responses I should say. I know one thing that comes up for me is businesses just being aware of their footprint. So we have one thought coming in. It's really important for businesses to minimize their negative externalities and to promote positive impact. So that's great to see. We've seen a few folks chime in here. Businesses should go above and beyond compliance with regulations and be more ambitious. So strive to do more. Don't just go with the do no harm, but look to actively improve. Nature positive solutions, these are some great ones coming in. Work together within catchments or within watersheds to manage impacts on biodiversity. Being more aware of the challenges that we're facing. So these are great. I'm seeing some common themes here. So now we will move on. I'm delighted to have a bit of a fireside chat now with Masaru Okubo, who is investment director at Sumitomo Mitsui Trust Asset Management. So I think we'll be bringing Masaru on in a moment here, and let me make sure I have my notes here. So welcome. I'm so glad you could join us today. So just wanted to start out and have you introduce yourself to our participants here, share about your role, and a little bit more about the firm that you work for.
Okay, first of all, I would like to say thank you for inviting me to this. I'm excited to share our thoughts on these increasingly important topics. My name is Masaru Okubo. I am a senior stewardship officer at Sumitomo Mitsui Trust Asset Management. Our company is asset manager based in Japan with the asset under management around over $700 billion US. We provide a variety of investment strategy in different asset classes, and our client space, mainly the institutional, including public and private pensions, but growing segments is retail. I am a part of the stewardship team is based in Tokyo, who the team deals with the proxy voting, engagement, ESG research, and so the team is based in Japan, and but we are sort of expanding global footprint for the stewardship activity. I'm based in New York, and I joined the team about 3 years ago. We have another office in London, so we cover the global companies and different entities. My experience is I've been on the active engagement, active investment side for over 20 years, and I moved to the stewardship team around 3 years ago. That's myself.
Yeah, it's great to have that background, a little bit of context for those joining in, what your perspective is. So Sumitomo as a firm is a member of both Ceres Land Use and Climate Working Group that Christine talked about earlier, and specifically within the biodiversity topic area, and is also part of the Valuing Water Investor Working Group, which is a part of our Valuing Water Finance initiative. So I'm just curious to hear from you, why are these topics of freshwater and biodiversity important to you as an institutional investor?
For our company, we have been the United Nations PRI signatories. We signed 2006, and even before that, early 2000, we started launched socially responsible investment strategy, trying to articulate the responsible way of investing, and the like signing up for PRI kind of articulated in the different ways. Now it's people broadly call them ESG, and through these organizations and the joining PRI, we follow the SDGs and global compacts. And pursuing those values, we believe that in a prudent and responsible way, that will create the long-term value for our investment, especially for the water and biodiversity. We tend to think it as a framework of natural capital, freshwater, marine water, fauna, flora. These are the resources on which the economic activities depends. And these are the resources subject to misuse, creation of externality, which impairs economic potential. So kind of at a high level, engagement with companies and other stakeholders to reduce those problems is kind of our goal in our stewardship, in particularly like engagement activities. I'm interested in water because it's tangible, kind of you can touch and measure. And sorry, I have resisted my temptation to touch on the fishing experience, but nice picture of the trout. I just say like personal passion of fishing is another kind of personal way to attach. But other people, everyone has kind of own experience because water is like such a very, very close to the human being. So I'm sorry, it's just a little bit digression, but the water also is a relatively, I think, an inexpensive way to mitigate those problems I mentioned. I refer to the CDP's latest report, which says like acting on water problem is not acting for water problems 5 times bigger than the not acting problems. Am I not acting? Confused.
Yeah, I think it was the cost of inaction. She said not acting on water risks is 5 times the cost of taking action. So if companies really, if they take action, they can save a lot on their bottom line. Based on some of the, the cost it takes after an externality might hit their balance sheet.
Okay. Thank you for helping me.
Yeah, well, no, that's fascinating. I'm glad you brought in that personal connection. I know for me too, I grew up in the Midwest of the United States, and so connecting and spending time along rivers, lakes, and streams is just has been so formative for me. And as Joel talked about, just I find a sense of peace and calm being in those places. So yeah, I'm glad you brought in your own personal connection as well. Yeah, and I'm curious just in terms of metrics and data sources. I know that's something that you probably work with every day in your work. What are some of the pieces that you are starting to refer to around biodiversity and freshwater, knowing that this is an emerging dynamic space, but curious if you can share some of your go-to resources or maybe reports that you're also reading.
Well, as you said, this is rapidly changing, and different organizations developing new database research and everything. For the engagement, I think CDP, water survey, is very useful because it goes to the company-specific way approach to the disclosing risk exposure management and governance. And some companies do well in the disclosure, but others, it's a level of granularity is quite different from one company to another. But also the Ceres Water Hub have developed the wide variety of tools, and that's very exhaustive. Also, and risk assessment, database, sector-based engagement guide, and also the external link to the other organizations like WRI, WWF. I'm not sure if you have a connection to, I'm sure you have a link to CDP as well. And yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, anything else on that front?
Well, another new initiative you're doing about valuing water risk is the, I think I'm part of the working group from the investor side, and I'm looking forward to the new development, which includes some of the systematic way to engage with company to achieve SDG 6 related to water, and that also includes the close connection with the biodiversity ecosystem between forest and wetlands and grasslands. So that's still like kind of early stage. Maybe if you can update a little bit now or later.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll be sharing more towards the end, but yeah, we're really grateful for your participation and leadership in our working groups developing that, and we'll be having more research coming out later in this calendar year and early into next year around the valuing water work. I'm just looking at the time, and our fireside chat is we're coming to a close here, so I want to just ask you if you have one piece of advice to share with other investors who are listening in and want to take on this work. What advice would you give?
This is like kind of a rapidly developing, and as Joel mentioned about the COP15 coming in, and biodiversity is closely related to water. So and it needs technical knowledge and expertise, which is difficult on ourselves as the investment organization. So joining the initiatives or the organization like Ceres, get some expertise and expert knowledge, help me engage with the company. So, it's just get started, look out for the new information, and try to achieve whatever the goal that will come at COP15, and preserve the nature.
Great. Well, thank you for this fireside chat. We're now going to move into the bit of time for some general Q&A. So we'll bring back in Joel and Christine to help us walk through some of the questions that have been coming in from the audience. So just to start with, we have one that's a bit of one that we can address for everyone, to Joel and Masaru, from your perspective, whether it's the foundation perspective or the investor perspective. what do you believe is the most effective way to communicate these interconnections between biodiversity and freshwater to your audiences? So Joel, let's start with you around, I know your communications is really core to your work. What do you think are some of the most effective ways to showcase these interconnections?
Well, that's a great question. And there has been research that shows, there's a spectrum upon which you can communicate and break through to your audience on challenging conservation issues. So whether it's climate change, whether it's biodiversity loss, whether it is uplifting the role of nature-based solutions in finance and investing, you've got to lead with optimism and lead with a sense of hope, a sense of what can be done and what is possible. It is challenging when you kind of lead with, all is lost, that we cannot do or meet the challenges that are in front of us because they seem so vast. So basically it's parsing it. A good example of this, especially as it comes to freshwater conservation, is something like the protection of Bristol Bay in Alaska. So it seemed inevitable that there was going to be a massive pit mine that would have disrupted the Bristol Bay area and ultimately contributed to the extinction of salmon species and biodiversity in that area. It absolutely seemed inevitable. However, through grassroots advocacy and grass tops and a deep respect of traditional and local and indigenous knowledge, as well as partnering with local businesses, not just the subsistence farmers and anglers, but also everyone who sought to be a part of that $1.5 billion economy, and then to consistently communicate the value of the land and the waters and the resource that they sat upon. They were able to turn that into a force that was able to impact policymaking and decisions. And I think what's really important to point out there, especially for the investor community, is it really also did engage the investor community. It also suggested that there were alternative ways to invest in Bristol Bay and Alaska, besides just this extractive industry of mining.
Thanks, Joel. Yeah, that's a great story and a good segue. Masaru, what are your thoughts around effectively communicating these perspectives and interconnections between biodiversity and freshwater?
I guess I need to, the job I have is the communicating with the company and getting out the message about those connections. And when we talk with the company on an individual company basis, when you think about those risks associated with the deforestation, water resources, climate change, it's getting obvious that the one solution leads to another. For example, like just fixing water pipe at waste management facility or the installing water pipe reduces methane emission, according to the latest, I think, a recent McKinsey study. And that is kind of also a little inexpensive way to approach. And so that's kind of a connection from one company, how you perceive the risks and how you mitigate and manage. Then it becomes kind of obvious. Problem I have is transcending a little bit up to the macro basis and trying to see the different parts of the connection, putting one together and make the engagement and change a bit more effective way. So that's a challenge, but we are seeking, we're trying to find out. But the basically what we have is we come from bottom-up engagement style.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that perspective. It's great to have for all of those. So, Christine, I'll turn it to you if you want to ask another question from the audience.
Yeah, we had a great question come in and I answered it, via the Q&A, but I feel like it's appropriate for Joel to answer. One person asked, what is the most impactful change food and fiber companies can make to their agricultural supply chains to increase biodiversity in areas they operate? Oh, you're on mute, Joel.
That is well, listen, I am not a scientist. Let me start by saying that, but I can tell you where I've seen some good solid evidence where the recommendations are well informed that I can share. So taking a step back, when thinking about biodiversity and what does biodiversity mean? It's about the diversity of life, right? It's not just about a single species. So just to give you just a brief example of that, if you think about recently in the last 40 or 50 years, we saw the sea otter population off of the California coast crash, and we also saw it recover. Now, what happened? So it crashed because there was large-scale pollution and there was degradation of the ecosystem, and there was the removal of some of the species there. But it also crashed because we were releasing so many nutrients into those waterways that we saw kelp beds kind of grow out of control. And that caused sea urchins to grow out of control. And we saw this sort of what we call a trophic cascade, where the entire ecosystem started to fail. And so through some careful restoration, protection, multi-stakeholder engagement, we were able to kind of restore some balance. And we saw, the apex predators, these sea otters return. Okay, so why does that matter to your question in the supply chain? Avoid, and this is the council, the monoculture approach, right? Avoid the approach where the answer is a single replacement for a good. A great example of this is that we often look for carbon offsets or biodiversity offsets, and we say, okay, I'm going to absorb 100 acres of an area that's very rich in biodiversity, but I'm going to replace that footprint with a monoculture of acacia wood. Now, monoculture is not healthy for biodiversity, which is about the diversity of life, in the entire ecosystem. So as you look at your supply chain, look for places and guidance on areas that you can preserve biodiversity, keep it intact as much as possible, and in areas where you have an opportunity to be what we call nature positive, to actually incorporate solutions that enhance an ecosystem where you may be drawing down resources in order to fulfill that part of the supply chain. And so, it's no one size fits all, right? Because every supply chain is different, but it's really about those choices you make along each phase. Just thinking about how do I enhance biodiversity, protect biodiversity, and avoid monocultures. That's the guidance that I can share.
No, that was great, Joel. And I think, I know we're coming up on time, but the fact is that every single ecosystem is different. And there's going to be a different approach on how to preserve its biodiversity. So back to Joel's point is you really need to go to the local level when it comes to some of those supply chains, and also just knowing where your product is coming from. So going back to your traceability and monitoring and making sure that any product currently being sourced is not coming from recently converted or deforested land. Because as we know, any type of land use or sea use change is one of the major drivers of biodiversity loss. So I'll send it back to Robin just to wrap up.
Thanks, Christine. Yes, so we will now move towards closing out this webinar. So your next steps, we have a great landing page and a resource page. So if we could just go back one slide if possible. Yes. So in your follow-up, you'll receive a link to access a landing page with a lot of the resources that we've discussed on this webinar. You can also learn more about some of Ceres resources, including the Investor Water Toolkit, our Valuing Water Finance Initiative, and the Land Use and Climate Working Group that have all been mentioned, and a special call out to our Ceres roadmap for 2030, which shows much more of these interconnections as well. So our final call to action here is to let us know what information around biodiversity or water is valuable to you. So for those of you who are still with us, we would love to hear your thoughts through our final mentee poll to get a sense of, you know, whether it's additional information would be helpful, what was shared today was really compelling or resonated with you. I know I'm taking away that coming from a place of hope and optimism around these issues that we face is a compelling place to start from. But I'm also really inspired by the science going into the work around biodiversity and water. So we'll give it another minute or so for folks to share their thoughts with us before we formally close. But as we're getting those in, I just want to give a special thank you to all of our panelists, Joel and Masaru, as well as my co-moderator, Christine, and we have a number of folks supporting us on the back end here. So having, you know, someone says it'd be great to have sector-based data with concrete actions to take as investors engage with companies on changing their practices. Someone is really lifting up that comment Joel made around avoiding monoculture approaches. That's great to lift up and share that as well. It would be helpful for folks to know how to get involved to maximize a more hyper-local impact. Great to see. We'll see if a few more come in. Identifying local solutions, that's great to lift up as well. And we'll see maybe if one more comes in and then we'll move towards closing. Great. Well, that might be it. So thank you all for joining. For those of you who stayed on, thank you for your time. We look forward to sharing out the resource page. Please keep in touch with us. You can find our contact information here, and this will also be on the slide. So thank you all for joining, and we look forward to continuing to collaborate in future initiatives and projects. So thank you.